Riddle Creek lay cradled in the dense embrace of the Pacific Northwest, a small town of fewer than 1,000 souls where the pines loomed like sentinels, their branches knitting a canopy that blotted out the sky. It was a place of quiet rhythms, children racing bikes down gravel lanes, the hum of a tractor in distant fields, the clink of coffee cups at the diner on Main Street. The air carried the perpetual scent of moss and resin, mingling with the faint tang of wood smoke curling from chimneys as autumn deepened. In 1987, the town stood on the cusp of October, the leaves turning brittle and gold, the evenings lengthening with a chill that seeped into the bones. For Ethan Mercer, a police officer with 5 years on the force, this was home. A sanctuary of predictable days and nights grounded in the solid weight of facts, figures, and evidence. He was the rational anchor in a sea of small-town superstitions, the man who dismissed tales of hauntings with a dry chuckle. That was before Katie Hammond disappeared, before the woods revealed a darkness that clawed at the edges of his reality. The call came on a Tuesday evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of bruised orange and casting jagged shadows across Ethan's cluttered desk at the Riddle Creek police station. He was sifting through a stack of paperwork, traffic citations, a report of a stolen garden gnome, when the phone's shrill ring sliced through the stillness. "Mercer, you there?" Joe Randall's voice crackled through, his partner of 3 years, a burly man with a quick laugh now edged with something taut, something Ethan couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of premonition. "Yeah, Joe, what's up?" Ethan replied, his hand already reaching for his worn leather jacket, the one that smelled faintly of tobacco and pine. "We've got a missing girl. Katie Hammond, 16. Parents say she didn't come home last night." Missing persons weren't unheard of in Riddle Creek. Teenagers occasionally drifted off, spending a night at a friend's house, sneaking beers by the creek, or slipping away with a fleeting romance, only to return with sheepish grins and half-hearted apologies. But Joe's tone carried a gravity that set Ethan's nerves alight. He drove to the Hammond house, a weathered farmhouse perched on the town's outskirts, its clapboard siding peeling like old skin. The woods pressed in close, a wall of shadow and needle that seemed to breathe with the wind. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Hammond stood as stark opposites. She, a trembling figure dissolving into tears, her handkerchief a sodden rag, and he, a pillar of rigid control, his jaw clenched so tight it might shatter. "She was supposed to be home by 9, Mr. Hammond said, his voice a strained thread. "She never misses curfew. Never." "Where was she last?" Ethan asked, his pen scratching against the notepad, the sound a faint counterpoint to Mrs. Hammond's stifled sobs. "The library," she managed, her words breaking, "to study for her history test. She always tells us where she's going. Always." Joe shot Ethan a look, a silent agreement passing between them. The library was a 10-minute walk, a straight shot down Miller Road, past the gas station and the shuttered feed store. They confirmed it with Mrs. Tate, the librarian, a wiry woman with a perpetual frown who remembered Katie hunched over a table, her auburn hair catching the fluorescent light until closing at 8:30. After that, the girl had stepped into the night and vanished. No one had seen her on the road. No cars had passed. No footsteps lingered in the dust. The trail was as cold as the frost beginning to rim the windows. That night, Ethan and Joe rallied a search party, a ragtag group of volunteers, farmers, shopkeepers, a few high school boys eager for action, armed with flashlights that cut pale beams through the growing dark. The woods around the Hammond property were a tangled sprawl, roots twisting underfoot, branches snagging at coats like skeletal hands. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the musk of earth disturbed by their passage. As they ventured deeper, an oppressive silence settled over them. No crickets sang, no owls called, no wind rustled the canopy. It was as if the forest held its breath, watching. Ethan had patrolled these woods before, knew their nocturnal pulse, but this stillness was alien, a void that pressed against his ears. "Over here!" Joe's shout broke the spell, sharp and urgent. They converged on a small clearing, the ground scuffed and bare, and there it lay, a circle of blackened stones, the ghost of a fire smoldering at its center, its embers winking like dying stars. Scattered around it were scraps of blue cotton, torn and frayed. Pieces of the jacket Katie had worn, the one her mother had described with a choked sob. "Looks like someone was here," Joe said, kneeling to sift through the ash, his fingers smudging black. "But where are they now?" Ethan's flashlight swept the perimeter, illuminating the trees, gnarled, ancient things, their bark fissured like old scars. A shiver traced his spine, not from the cold but from a sensation he couldn't name, an awareness, primal and unyielding, that something watched from beyond the light's reach. The group lingered, voices hushed, until midnight loomed, and they agreed to resume at dawn. As they trudged back, Ethan felt it still, eyes on his back, a weight that followed him to the edge of the trees and beyond. Days stretched into weeks, each sunrise a hollow echo of the last. The search swelled, more volunteers, bloodhounds baying through the underbrush, their handlers shouting commands. But Katie remained a specter, her absence a wound that festered in the town's heart. The Hammonds unraveled, Mrs. Hammond retreating into silence, Mr. Hammond pacing the porch like a caged animal, his eyes hollow. Ethan threw himself into the case, forsaking sleep for the dim glow of the station's fluorescent lights, poring over maps and witness statements that led nowhere. Then, one night, as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., he stumbled upon it. A file from the 1930s, buried in a rusted cabinet, its pages brittle and yellowed. Disappearances, all girls, all young, all last seen near these woods, each report mentioning a strange clearing with a circle of stones. The details blurred into folklore, whispers of an ancient presence, a predator that lured its quarry into the trees, never to return. Ethan's rational mind recoiled, but the handwriting was real, the dates stark against the page, a mirror to Katie's fate. Skepticism warred with desperation as he sought out Mrs. Abernathy, the town historian, a woman whose rambling house on Oak Street was a shrine to Riddle Creek's past. Shelves groaned under the weight of books, artifacts glinted in the lamplight. Arrowheads, old photographs, a cracked porcelain doll with one glass eye. She peered at the files over her wire-rimmed glasses, her lips thinning. "The woods have a dark history," she said, her voice a low rasp, weathered by years of storytelling. "Legends speak of an evil there, something old, something that preys on the young and innocent. They call it the Watcher." Ethan scoffed, leaning back in the creaking chair. "Sounds like a fairy tale to scare kids." She fixed him with a stare, her eyes sharp as flint. "Maybe, but every tale has a root in truth. You'd do well to heed it." With no other thread to pull, Ethan and Joe returned to the clearing, the metal detector humming in Joe's hands, its beeps a faint pulse against the silence. The air felt heavier now, the trees leaning closer, their shadows pooling like ink. They unearthed more, strips of fabric, a scattering of buttons, a rusted locket that clicked open to reveal a faded photograph of a girl. Her dress dated to the 1930s, her eyes blank and staring. "One of the old cases?" Ethan murmured, turning the locket over, its edges biting into his palm. Then it came, a whisper, faint as a sigh, threading through the stillness. "Help me, please." Katie's voice, unmistakable, trembling with terror. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his head snapping up. Joe frowned, adjusting the detector's dials. "Hear what?" It sounded again, clearer, a plea that tugged at Ethan's gut. He seized his flashlight and plunged into the trees, the beam bouncing wildly, Joe following with a reluctant grunt. The whisper grew, a desperate thread weaving through the branches, guiding them to a smaller clearing. At its heart stood an ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened, its branches twisting like the limbs of a tortured soul. At its base, half concealed by roots that clawed the earth, was a wooden door, its surface weathered to a dull gray. "What the hell is this?" Joe muttered, his voice tight. The whispers poured from behind it, a chorus of fear that raised the hairs on Ethan's neck. His pulse thundered as he gripped the handle, cold as ice, unyielding, and wrenched it open. A gust of frigid air blasted out, carrying the stench of mold and something older, something rotten. Beyond the threshold, a staircase spiraled down into darkness, its edges slick with damp. "Stay close," Ethan said, his breath clouding in the chill as he stepped inside. Joe followed, his flashlight trembling in his grip, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The air thickened with a musty reek, the passage narrowing as they descended, the stone steps uneven beneath their boots. At the bottom, a corridor stretched forward, its walls glistening with moisture, the faint drip of water echoing in the gloom. A flicker of light danced ahead, pulling them toward a chamber carved from the earth. There, huddled on the floor, lay Katie, her clothes torn, her auburn hair matted with dirt, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to swallow her whole. "Katie!" Ethan rushed to her, kneeling as her tears soaked his sleeve, her voice a broken whisper. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" Joe demanded, his flashlight sweeping the chamber, illuminating rough-hewn walls and a dirt floor stained with age. Footsteps answered, slow, deliberate, a rhythmic thud that reverberated off the stone. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its face a mask of hollowed flesh, its eyes black voids that drank the light. "The Watcher! Run!" Ethan shouted, hauling Katie to her feet, her weight slight and trembling against him. They bolted down the corridor, the creature's steps pounding behind, the air turning to ice, the walls seeming to pulse inward. They scrambled up the stairs, its breath a searing heat on Ethan's neck as he slammed the door shut, the wood splintering under a force that shook the frame. They didn't stop until they stumbled into the clearing, gasping, the woods falling silent once more, as if the night had swallowed the horror whole. Katie clung to Ethan as they raced back to town, her frail form trembling beneath his arm. The Hammonds wept at her return, their joy a fragile thing shadowed by the hollow look in her eyes, a look that spoke of something stolen, something lost beyond retrieval. In the days that followed, Ethan sat with Mrs. Abernathy, poring over crumbling texts and faded maps, unearthing tales of the Watcher from old European lore. A being that fed on fear, that trapped souls in a liminal realm between worlds, its presence a stain on the fabric of reality. Katie recovered in body, but her spirit dimmed, her laughter replaced by a quiet dread that clung like damp rot. Ethan couldn't erase the image of those black eyes, couldn't silence the whispers that invaded his dreams. Katie's voice? Or something wearing it like a mask? The case closed officially, a neat report filed away, but the woods cast a long shadow over Riddle Creek. Ethan patrolled their edges, his senses sharpened by every rustle, every flicker of movement in the dark. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the wind carried whispers, Katie's pleas, or an echo twisted by something older, reminding him that some truths eluded the grasp of reason. He didn't believe in monsters, not in the storybook sense, but he'd come to understand that there were forces in the world that defied explanation, that waited in the quiet spaces. And in those still moments, when the darkness pressed close, Ethan felt the Watcher's gaze, patient and unyielding. 8 years later, in the fall of 1995, Riddle Creek faced a new terror. Roy Bennett, a native son who'd followed his father into the police force, stood at the helm of a town that had patched itself together after Katie's ordeal. The scars remained, doors locked at dusk, children kept close, but life had resumed its slow cadence. Roy was a steady man, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, his hands calloused from years of service, his eyes carrying the weight of his father's pride. That autumn, the woods stirred again, their silence breaking with a series of vanishings that tore the town's fragile peace apart. It began with Lily Thompson, a 10-year-old with curls like spun sunlight and a smile that could thaw the coldest day. She vanished from her backyard one evening, the swing still swaying gently, her laughter snuffed out mid-breath. No signs of a struggle marred the grass, no footprints led away, just absence, stark and sudden. A month later, Tom Weaver, a mechanic whose hearty laugh once echoed through the garage on Elm Street, disappeared on his morning jog, his route along the creek left eerily untouched. Then Frank Carter, a retired schoolteacher with a gentle demeanor, walked his dog by the water's edge and never returned. The dog, a graying mutt named Buster, came back alone, its tail tucked, its whines a mournful dirge. The town rallied, search parties fanning out across the woods, their voices calling into the void. Lily's name, Tom's, Frank's, until they grew hoarse. Roy led the efforts, his boots sinking into the mud, his flashlight cutting through the mist that clung to the trees. The woods offered nothing. No tracks, no scraps, just an oppressive stillness that mocked their desperation. Rumors swirled like smoke. Wild animals, cougars or bears unseen for decades. Old native legends of forest spirits that claimed the unwary. Fear tightened its grip, doors bolted shut, children confined indoors. The once open streets now deserted after dusk. Roy felt the weight of it, the town's trust pressing against his chest, their hope a burden he couldn't shed. One night, as the first snow of the season dusted the ground, Sarah Weaver, Tom's wife, called Roy, her voice a fractured whisper through the phone. "Roy, I found something." She met him on her porch, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she handed him a note scrawled in Tom's blocky handwriting. "There in the woods. Don't look. Don't follow." It had been hidden under his pillow, slipped between the sheets like a secret too heavy to speak aloud. Roy's blood ran cold, the words a warning that echoed the dread he'd felt since Lily's disappearance. He and his partner Jake, a wiry man with a smoker's rasp and a steady hand, ventured into the woods that night, the snow crunching under their boots, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The trees loomed taller in the dark, their branches skeletal against the clouded sky. Hours passed, the cold biting through their coats, until Jake stumbled on a dilapidated cabin, its walls sagging, its windows black as pitch. It felt wrong, too still, too present, a blemish on the forest's face. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, a trapdoor yawning in the floorboards. They descended, Roy's flashlight revealing a basement carved from the earth, walls etched with symbols that twisted the eye, a stone altar stained with something dark and old, personal items scattered like offerings. A child's shoe, scuffed and small. A watch, its hands frozen. A pair of glasses, lenses cracked. "This is where they took them," Roy said, his voice shaking, the realization sinking into his bones. The trapdoor slammed shut above them, the sound a thunderclap in the confined space, plunging them into darkness. Roy's flashlight flickered and died, panic clawing at his throat as the air grew heavy, pressing against his lungs. Jake's breathing rasped beside him, their hands groping along the walls until a faint breeze guided them to a tunnel narrow and damp. They crawled through, dirt smearing their faces, emerging into the forest as dawn broke, the sky a pale smear above the trees. When they returned with backup, the cabin stood empty, no altar, no symbols, as if the night had scrubbed it clean. The disappearances stopped, but Riddle Creek bore the scars. Sarah moved away, unable to face the echoes of Tom's absence. The Thompsons followed, seeking a fresh start. Roy stayed, tethered to the town, haunted by the wood's silence, by the feeling that something lingered, watching. Every rustle of leaves, every creak in the night. It was a reminder that some evils didn't vanish. They bided their time. What would you do, reader, if you stood at the threshold of those woods, the air thick with whispers and unseen eyes? Could you bear the weight of their secrets? Or would you flee, leaving the shadows to fester? The forbidden excavation dares you to imagine, because some stories don't end with the dawn. They linger, threading through the dark, waiting for the next soul to listen.